At this time, I'd like to introduce Janine. You're taking a look at her bio right now, and she is the Chief Innovation Officer and owner of Talent Think Innovations. She's also the founder and chief blogger at a really great blog that I totally check out daily, the Aristocracy of HR. She has 10 years of HR experience, and I think as you go through this, you're going to see why all of these companies have quoted her before, because she is very wise and she totally gets this. I'm so excited to have her here today, and Janine, I'm going to let you take it from there.
Woohoo! That was a great introduction. Thank you so much. That's awesome. Thank you, everybody, for joining me today for this webinar. Every recruiter should be a diversity recruiter, and this is just something that I really, really believe in. If you look at anything that I've done this year and before, you'll see that there's a constant theme. And just to give you some more background on where I've come from, so I was in HR for 10 years, and more specifically so in the federal contractor space. And so I was in that drudgery of dealing with OFCCP daily. And if you are a federal contractor, you know that a lot of that space has changed tremendously in the past 10 years. And you just have to kind of think on the fly about how you approach these things. And so then, on the flip side of that, diversity is just a huge, larger than life issue in general, whether you're a federal contractor or not. So I just feel like this information I'm going to give to you today, like if there's anything that I want you to take away from this, is just understanding that what you do with regard to diversity is really around a change of mindset and a change of approach, more so than it's about the actual strategy. So I think as HR practitioners, we tend to just think about things in the sense of how can we get done whatever it is we're being asked to do quickly and painlessly, right? So essentially what I want to get you away from is the reactiveness, and I want to get you to be somewhat proactive, and I hope I can get you there by the end of this webinar. So let's kick it off. What is the state of recruitment and diversity? And so this picture may look kind of crazy to you, but I'm going to explain. So you have recruitment, and in recruitment, it's just crazy. Every day is a crazy day. Unless you have a very, very low volume recruitment team, it can get pretty onerous. You're managing requisitions, you're sourcing and screening for candidates, you're running your interviews, you're dealing with offers, you're putting out fires with hiring managers. It's a lot. And so that in and of itself is a job. And then here comes somebody that says to you, hey, I need you to focus on diversity. And you say to yourself, yes, diversity is important. However, I've got all this other stuff to do. How do I fit this in? How am I going to be effective in this? So, recruitment on its own has its own thing, and it's just way overextended in many organizations. Diversity, when you look at diversity separately, it's on its own mountain, and that's exactly what this picture is trying to depict. It's on its own mountain. It's being rained on. There's clouds hanging over it because nobody wants to touch it. It's kind of like the stepchild that everybody knows they need to address, but they're not touching it. And so they kind of keep them over there, and you kind of dip your hand under there to feel the rain every so often when, you have to, because the situation has arisen or because you've had your hand slapped and you realize now that diversity does need to have a common place in everything that you do, from recruitment through succession planning. So I wanted to explain this slide some more, but this is really from my perspective and what I've seen over the past 10 years, how recruitment and how HR kind of interacts with diversity, and it needs to change. So, how do we change that? We change that by getting everybody up under that umbrella, and the umbrella is a diversity strategy, right? So we don't want diversity sitting on its own mountain, getting rained on with clouds all over. I mean, who wants to do that? We need recruitment working with diversity. We need the C-suite working on this. We need hiring managers. We need everybody in the organization working on this. And this is exactly why I coined the title of this webinar what I did, because it really isn't one person's job. It's everybody's job. And, within that scope, there's just a lot of finger pointing. So, I mean, it's going to take time, understand, to get under that umbrella and for everybody to be cozy with one another under that diversity strategy and kind of moving that strategy forward. But in the interim, we have to recognize what's polarizing us in the meantime. And what I've seen is a lot of pointing the finger, right? Diversity is recruitment job to focus on. Well, what is diversity doing? Well, what are the hiring managers doing? Well, we need the leadership to do something. It's like when it comes down to it, because we're always in such a state of being reactive, there's a lot of finger pointing, none of which is productive. But the question is how do we start to work collectively towards this goal of, having a more diverse workforce? And the strategies, are not necessarily inherent in just saying I have a strategy. For instance, every year you have Diversity Inc. that puts out a list of some nominees of companies they feel are doing the right thing with regard to diversity, and I would highly implore you to take a look at that. Even within those companies, and these are companies that are so-called doing the best practices industry-wide as far as diversity strategy, there are deficits. There are deficits because there are just so many moving parts when you're going to talk about diversity strategy. So, when the moving parts, just to give you an idea, are, what does it look like in terms of supplier diversity? Are you patronizing other businesses that are diverse? Your talent pipeline, what does that look like from a diversity standpoint? Equitable talent development, what does that look like? How involved is your leadership? We'll get to talk about that later on in the presentation. And then another thing that people don't really think about as a diversity initiative, which is work-life initiatives, and that becomes huge, especially with, a largely millennial Gen Z workforce coming towards us in the next few years. So, like I said, I don't believe that this is one person's job. And so, for the companies that I've seen that have said, hey, you know what, we're going to hire this diversity recruiter, I say to them, that's not really a strategy. So I know what this looks like from the inside. It looks like, hey, recruitment, we want you to focus more on diversity. This is one of our goals. We've got to get ahead of this. And recruitment pushes back and they say, hey, this is taking a lot of time. I've got X amount of jobs to fill. I've got all these other things moving. This is just a lot. And so they say, okay, well, what if we hire one person to just focus on recruiting diverse candidates? Well, it sounds good that you'd have one person that now takes that burden off of recruitment, but what almost always happens is you almost always end up with a situation where you have everybody kind of with a hands-off approach to it, and they just say, well, the diversity recruiter is handling it, and that's it. That's not a strategy. That's a quick fix, and if it looks that way from the inside, it certainly looks that way from the outside to candidates, and that's really not the message that you want to give off. I'm not telling you in this slide not to hire somebody to do that. I'm just telling you to be mindful that it is a very reactive strategy to put in place. And unless you let everybody else know on the team that they are equally responsible for diversity within the organization, you're going to have that burden on one person. And so it's, again, going back to that first slide of diversity kind of being on this mountain by themselves and being rained on and having to deal with the bigger than life idea of diversity on their own with no other support. So, as I'm speaking, I want you to kind of think about where you are today in terms of your strategy and be thinking about whether you are more reactive or closer to proactive. And so this is how I'm going to kind of help you visualize or conceptualize where you are. So for me, when I see a diversity strategy, and I'm thinking reactive. I'm thinking that we're looking at our strategy or our hiring from a quota perspective. So I can't tell you how many times I've spoken to people, HR practitioners over the years about, hiring, having a competitive slate, having diverse slates and mandating that with their recruitment teams. And for whatever reason, almost always there's somebody or a few out of the bunch that see this as, oh, well, this is a quota situation, right? I've got to hire X amount of African Americans, X amount of, Latinos or Hispanic, X amount of Asians. And it blows my mind that that's what they get from that. That is not, not at all what this is about. It's not about having a little bit of this and a little bit of that and sticking to a set of numbers to be able to say, well, I hired 5 African Americans this year, so, our diversity strategy must be fine because we did that. It's really, if you step back from diversity on the whole, really what we're talking about is getting the right people in the right position. However, in the interim of that, we have a situation where there's just not enough equity. And so we've got to make those equities whole. That's what we're trying to do. But by no means does that mean to revert to quota hiring where you're doing this by, okay, this year we'll hire 5 African Americans and that year we'll hire 6. You need to get the right people, but you need to kind of cast the net wider so you can get a lot of different people. So that would make you reactive if you were looking at your diversity strategy from that lens. If you were just sitting back and you've kind of jumped on the bandwagon of all these diversity sites that have somehow cropped up in the wake of OFCCP's rulings and guidances over the past few years, they're good for disseminating information, but it's not a strategy. It's literally you just kind of spraying out your jobs to a lot of different sites and hoping that somebody is going to, obviously, latch on to your job and maybe apply, and then you can say, well, hey, we actually do have a diverse pool. It's a hope and a prayer. It's just like the spray and pray when we talk about, just typically spraying and praying job postings out to the career builders and the monsters. It's no different with diversity. You're not doing anything there that's good other than getting your jobs out there to many different sites. You don't even know if it has any visibility. Recruiting from referral sources that have underrepresentation. So I'll give you for instance, LinkedIn, which, seems to be a go-to now for a lot of recruiters. I love LinkedIn. I've found a lot of great people on LinkedIn. However, LinkedIn is highly, highly underrepresented for blue-collar workers that are minorities. So if you were working for a company that needed those sorts of workers and you needed to garner a competitive, diverse slate from that one referral source, you would be banging your head against the wall trying to figure out how you can get that because those people are just simply not there. They're not there. So that would also be reactive. So you have to be looking at your referral sources. You have to be willing to actually do some work. And it can't just be about numbers. It's actually much more about relationships, actually. So that's where we get over into the proactive side. On the proactive side, we're talking about building real relationships and partnerships. And again, I'll go back to OFCCP and what has come down as of late. One of the things that has come about is that they recognize that companies were just kind of spraying and praying with these diversity sites, and that was the way that they were so-called reaching out or doing their good faith efforts. Well, now you've got to be actually cultivating relationships. They don't any longer want you just putting your jobs out on sites that don't make sense or that you're not actually getting candidates from. So that's one of those parameters that are put in place. And it's interesting because many times when I speak about these things, you get a lot of hemming and hawing by HR practitioners, and I was one of them too, but when you step back from it, they're not really asking for anything that's unreasonable. You should be building real relationships and partnerships. If you truly care about diversity, then that's what you should be doing. And you should be regularly evaluating your referral sources. Like, why would you continue to pull or pay for a service or referral source that's not actually getting you candidates? So it would be no different whether it was a diversity site or if it was just a regular job site that you were using. You really should be evaluating these things. And again, it just comes down to, quality over quantity. It's very, admittedly, especially if you're looking at it as a federal contractor, the way that they have set up the system, it's very hard to work it from a standpoint where it doesn't end up being a quota, because there's just a lot of numbers. They give you availability numbers and, your underrepresentations. And so just the way that we're wired as HR practitioners, it's natural for us to look at those numbers and say, okay, how do we begin to bring that number down? And when you start to bring that number down, then you start to say to yourself, okay, well, how many people has it taken to get that, underrepresentation for African Americans, let's just say, in an engineering classification, down to this number where it's no longer an underrepresentation. And it almost gives you the impetus to say, okay, well, that's down, that's done, and you want to shut down. But it's really not about that. It's about the overall strategy and whether you're dedicated to having a workforce that is truly representative of our society, of our world. Our society and our world is very diverse. So if you look at the composite of your company and it just doesn't quite mirror that, that's a problem. That's a problem. It's a problem for you to attract people that look like others to your company, and it's a problem in general from a knowledge standpoint. It's been proven over and over again, companies that have diverse people in it just perform better. And to that point, what are the many flavors of diversity? There's just so many, and it's not like it's any more than it's ever been, but it's so much more in your face now that you have no choice but to recognize it. So, and the other piece that is probably different too is that you have all of these different people working at the same time. So you have many more programs now that are empowering those that are differently abled, whatever that may be, to be actively in the workforce working. You have millennials, you have Gen Z, you have, veterans, going back as far as, World War II up to just the recent wars that are out there and still looking for some semblance of work. And then you have, all the race demographics as well. So there's so many different pockets and flavors for you to kind of look at and segments of the workforce that it's hard for you to just have this really holistic diversity strategy that says, well, hey, we're going to hire this one person, again, going back to the diversity recruiter, we're going to hire this one person, and somehow this person's just going to have that magic that's going to bring all of these people in. You really need a lot of different people. You need a lot of different mentors, a lot of different, professionals within your workforce that are dedicated to seeing or helping and mentoring these people into the company and helping them succeed while they're there. Because I think we miss that point a lot, which is that it's one thing to get them in, but when they get in, what does that look like? And that's a large portion of the missing, I guess, aha around diversity strategy. So just, another word on OFCCP, just because it's near and dear to my heart, and I think there are many more federal contractors than not. Getting ahead of your underrepresentation, if you want to do that, you have to stop focusing on just numbers. Never mind the underrepresentation. You have to focus on it, yes, because you have to report, but you also have to be dedicated to putting more people into these roles that are minorities, period. Female, African American, Asian, whatever have you, differently able veterans, you have to just be dedicated to seeing these people thrive in your workforce. That's what it comes down to. It's not about hiring 10, hiring 20. And when you do reach the point where you no longer have an underrepresentation, don't stop. This is the thing that has driven me crazy. I would have managers that would look at our affirmative action plan for the year and literally say, oh, wow, we finally got ahead of that underrepresentation. All right, what's the next one? We don't have to worry about that one. And I would always say to them, absolutely, we have to worry about it. Because if we don't worry about it, if we stop our hiring efforts, our diversity efforts in those job classifications, we're going to end back up at some particular point, we're going to end up with an underrepresentation again. So again, it's moving from being reactive to proactive. Don't stop your efforts once you've reached the point. You have to continue with it. And, you know, the other thing too is I've found that a lot of the diversity initiatives live and die by people's accountability in the organization. So if you don't have any accountability measures around your diversity strategy, it's probably going to die. And the way that you can kind of keep that alive is by tying that back to, you know, your recruiter's performance as well as the performance of your leadership. Everybody's got to be accountable in this. And I can't say enough about good faith efforts. There's no good faith effort if there's nothing genuine behind it. So, you know, people just think, oh, there are these efforts that we're doing and it's forward facing and it looks good that we're doing it. Well, it shouldn't just look good. It should feel good and it should be good genuinely. And again, this just comes back to changing the approach, changing your mindset. So what does success look like? I wanted to kind of break this out between attraction and development because I think it's important to look at it from both of those aspects. So when we talk about attraction, which is really like recruitment, your sourcing, all of that, what does success look like when you're talking about a diversity strategy? So you want to have quality lead funnels. You need to know that the ones that you're the places that you're tapping into are getting you quality people. That's first and foremost. So, you know, if you've got like a few organizations and like 5 websites that you can go into, let's just say it's like, you know, National Society for, you know, Black Accountants, and you're tapping into that for your accounting jobs. You need to be looking at that yearly, quarterly, whatever it is, to be sure that the people that are coming out of that or the people you're being sent are good and that they actually have a trajectory in your process, that they're moving not just from a lead, but moving from a lead to a candidate to somebody that gets interviewed to potentially someone that gets hired. If you've gone 2-3 years never ever hiring anybody from any of the lead funnels that you're kind of capturing candidates from, what's the point? Training every recruiter on performing fair and proper interviews. This seems very, very simple, but it's something that has to happen more and more and more, and especially so not just from a racial perspective, but also too from dealing with the differently abled. And I'll give an example with this as well. I'm amazed at how many recruiters don't know, you know, how to approach certain segments of the differently abled. You know, if you're speaking to somebody who is blind, you know, how do you interview them? You know, if you're speaking to somebody who has a speech interpreter, you know, the fact that you should be speaking directly to the person, even though they're not the ones that are really speaking, it's really the speech interpreter, you know, making eye contact with them. Like those little things, these are just kind of those like cultural awareness, you know, just demographic specific things that recruiters need to know and they need to be prepared for, and they shouldn't be getting into an interview not knowing how to approach these different demographics. I'm not saying come up with something different for everybody, but in a sense you do need to be able to tailor those things and to have them be prepared for those instances. having a very visible portion of your career website dedicated to what diversity looks like in your company is extremely important. If I go to your website, as a candidate or a prospective candidate, just kind of browsing, and, I want to know if someone like me, can thrive in your company as a Latina or as an Asian woman, I would want to be able to go there and see somebody that looks like me, maybe on video, maybe, in a short Q&A. You can get really creative with this, and many companies have. But I think it really does need to jump out at you. It needs to be conspicuous because it is becoming more and more of a consideration, especially for young professionals, about where it is that they're going to hang their hat next. They want to know that the environment that they're entering is one that is welcoming to them in whole as a person, and that there's a trajectory for them. And the other piece of it from an attraction standpoint is just making sure that your recruitment team, again, this comes back to accountability, is assigned at least one diversity initiative or organization. So each one of the recruiters on your team should have some segment to work on. So by having one take on one segment, you don't even need a diversity recruiter. Everybody just takes an initiative. Everybody takes, one organization or whatever, and they build that relationship, and it gives them a hand in kind of, pushing the diversity agenda forward, and it gives them something to own and be accountable for, and you can tie it back to performance. It just makes sense. When it comes to development, this, again, was in the beginning what I said in terms of us we stop at the let's get them in, but what happens when they get in? What happens when we get a bunch of great diverse candidates in? What are we doing with them then? And so I'll share a quick story. I had a webinar earlier this year, and I believe she was a leader. The woman on the call at the time said, well, we do the best we can with our diversity strategy, and we actually hired a ton of Hispanics to come into our company, and they're doing well, and they're doing great, and we do really well in that. And I think that she meant it for like an engineering position, that she had hired a bunch of Hispanics. And so I turned to her, I turned the question back on her and basically said, what does success look like when you talk about the fact that you hired Hispanics into the company, into engineering positions? How do you know that they're successful? How do you know that they're doing well? Are you following them? Because I know as a recruiter, you hire people into the company, you follow them for a while, unless you've put something in place, and then after a while, they just kind of drop off. I mean, they just do. Everybody gets busy. And if you happen to see them around campus or wherever, it's like, hey, how's everything going? And that's how that is. So, my question to her was, how are you measuring success? Those, for all of the Hispanics that you've brought in those job classifications, how many of them are getting promoted? How many of them are making lateral transfers? How many of them are actively involved in mentorship situations and or learning and development opportunities? And so if you can't answer that question, then you can't honestly say that they're thriving, because the whole goal is not just to get them in, it's to get them in and have them thriving. So from a success looks like from a development standpoint is, you need to be doing regular compensation checks. You need to be doing checks for equity issues, and you need to be ahead of that. There's a lot of talk right now about pay equity, especially where women are concerned. You need to be ahead of that. And the way that you get ahead of that is to be honest with yourself and actually do these checks and look at the data objectively, and even have someone else look at the data objectively and look at the trends. And if there's things that look funny or it stinks to the high heavens in terms of certain groups being paid more than others, and especially if that starts to look that way across genders and races, that has to change immediately. There's no question about it. There's just none. So that's one way that you can start to move towards success. I personally am a huge fan of employee resource groups, or what they call affinity groups. And so, if you don't have those in your organization, it's worth looking at um, starting a program where those can kind of flourish within the company. Many, top companies that are, best in practice, if you will. I hate that word, by the way, but it's the jargon we use. Have employee resource groups, and I can tell you from personal experience that it's very rewarding to be working for a company where the voice of different demographics are heard through these groups, and that you can get together with people, of your same culture or whatever that is, and brainstorm ideas to move the workforce or that company, in directions that maybe even the CEO is not thinking of. So I was actually even the president of the employee resource group in my last position. And, we had a hand in everything from speaking with the recruiters and brainstorming ways to tap into other segments of, demographics that we were maybe underrepresented in. So it's great if you have one. Your recruiters should be regularly attending those meetings and getting ideas from those people in those groups, because they're just full of knowledge and they already work for the company, which is a win-win. And it's just a matter of coordinating efforts. So this is something that I'm just going to throw out there. It's a freebie, it's a bonus, food for thought. Diversity, in my opinion, is something that should sit on its own and this is me talking about from an organizational standpoint. What I've seen when diversity comes up under either HR or some other group within the organization is there tends to be a lack of trust with the employees and diversity when they're under some other division within the organization. When you have diversity standing on its own and there is a direct line for it into the CEO, it's almost the best case scenario on all accords, in the sense that the CEO then has the ultimate accountability to diversity. That's the first thing. Two, he or she has their eye exactly on the programs and initiatives coming out of that office. And three, many times there are things going on in the workforce, and I'm sure we can all attest to our share of employee relations issues. When they sit independently of any of these other divisions, they can really act as an objective body within the organization to deal with any diversity issues. It works out for everybody involved. So if you're in a position to affect this kind of thing and diversity is sitting up under some division somewhere in some pocket in your organization and it isn't thriving, you may want to look at that reporting relationship, because I believe it's extremely key in its success within the organization. It should be independent of everything else and sit as an objective body that doesn't belong to any one person or any one division. It just exists to make sure that the workforce is made whole by inviting a lot of different people into it. So just something to think about. So the truth, I mean, you may think, well, what does the truth have to do with anything? The truth is important in all of this. And the reason why is because many times the things that we're not tackling when it comes to diversity strategy are the things we just, it's sticky. It's the things that we don't want to touch because it just has greater ramifications. It's going to open us up to have conversations that are uncomfortable, that maybe we don't want to have. And so we look for the easiest thing to do instead of the hardest thing to do, which is to really objectively look at the situation and make some determinations and fix it. So that is to say, for instance, if you were to take my advice and you were to start to do, equity checks against compensation, and let's just say you come up with the fact that, for whatever reason, females working as, let's just say you're in healthcare, working as unit receptionists are making $10 less than the male unit receptionist in the same job classification. Well, that's not a good thing. You can identify that. Two, your next thing is, well, we can't tell them that that's the case. And then three, there's a reluctance very often to fix said equity. On all accords, you're just anything that you can possibly come up with in terms of a diversity strategy. If you do those three things, you have shot yourself in the foot. Transparency is huge, huge. It's a huge boost for your diversity strategy. And in fact, there are quite a few companies now that are moving towards being much more transparent about, their diversity in terms of how many people or how much of each demographic they have at different levels in the organization. They're just putting it out there, and you have to be able to do that internally as well. There's absolutely nothing wrong with saying, look, we did a check and we've realized that there's a deficit on this end and it lies with women, and we want you to know that we're going to do an independent investigation and that we're going to really look at this and we're going to look at how we can correct this. I'm not saying before you know all the pieces. This is when you know what you know, you've got to actually voice it and do something about it. And if you do something about it, it makes those people that were affected feel like, you know what, wow, this is a place that I want to work. And in fact, this is a place I'd want to tell other people like me to come and work. So this is where truth kind of comes into it. It's being honest with yourself and then being honest with your employees. And you'd be shocked at where this takes your diversity strategy when you can do this. So when I talked about transparency and the like, these are just a few of the companies that are, at least in the past year or two, I've seen have been putting out information on, what does diversity look like in their companies. And I want you to know that for all four of them, none of them have like a clean slate. None of them have a clean bill of diversity health, if you will. It's not a perfect situation. They all admit to it. But I think what you have to grant them is the fact that they're actually being vulnerable enough to put the data out there for others to see where they're making, marginal improvements and where they're just still struggling. And I think more companies should be willing to do that. The one that I loved the most was Salesforce, I think because they have a lot of pretty pictures and it's less text than anything else, but they break it down by job classification, how many of each group and what it looked like from year to year, and where they plan to make improvements and what the corrective actions are. I mean, it's just phenomenal. And I think it speaks to this whole trend that I'm seeing just in general across HR of open HR and just sharing what we know instead of sitting in our respective offices in our companies and kind of dealing with these issues on our own, is doing more of this group think and share between one another to understand where are we individually falling short and where collectively are we falling short, and then kind of collectively crafting some solutions around this. So I would highly suggest just punching in a term on Google diversity transparency and you'll see all of the data. It's absolutely phenomenal. So, one of the things I do want you to take away from this is it is absolutely, absolutely essential that you have leadership, CEO buy-in where it comes to diversity. If you're running a diversity program now and your CEO is very peripherally involved with any of the initiatives, you're in a lot of trouble. It has to be bought from the top, and it has to be supported from the top. And I believe that these strategies live and die based on that level of support. Again, just reiterating that everyone in the organization must be held accountable for contributing to diversity efforts. It is not one person. You will not hire a diversity recruiter and things will magically happen. They can be great at their job. I'm not knocking anybody that's in a diversity recruiter role now. I'm just saying that it is a completely huge and onerous burden to lay on one person when the joy really should come from everybody being involved in this endeavor. I also want to point out that it can take time to see the ROI on your efforts. I know everything now is about instant gratification and seeing an immediate return on your efforts, but many times it will take you time to see the ROI for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes there's an underrepresentation in a particular group that's not seeing a lot of diverse candidates being funneled into that particular industry. So I saw that a lot in the sciences. There were some job groups that just didn't have a great representation for African Americans or for Latinos. Those are job groups that if you see an underrepresentation there, that is due to how many people are being funneled in from an education standpoint, how many people are even going into the field to begin with. So you still have to try to find the diamonds in the rough. You don't stop that, but understand that the ROI on something like that would be a lot longer than, say, something, a job group like an administrative assistant where you might see a lot of minorities constantly funneling through your pool. So you have to think about that. You also have to think about a trust factor. Sometimes we have seen, or groups of people have seen, so much disparity in a certain industry for so long that it's going to take time for them to trust you again. And so if that was the case, then it may take a long time before they get like, oh, okay, company A really is dedicated to diversity. You know what? Maybe I should look at them again and maybe apply or, work for them or whatever the case is. So in this regard, you kind of have to settle for the small wins. And obviously, if you can get the big wins, it's great, but just understand that this is a process. Partnering with diverse organizations and associations to build programs and initiatives, this is huge, huge, huge. And you would be shocked to know how many of them are so willing and ready to want to partner with businesses. They have such a surplus. I work with a number of organizations that cater to veterans and the differently abled. They have a surplus of people that they need to put to work, and their budgets and the money that they receive from the states are all hinged upon them getting these people work. And they just are in such a shortage for companies to work with where they can either have these people intern, apprenticeship, even part-time jobs. Sometimes it's just like part-time jobs. They're willing to work out anything. So definitely start looking at organizations and associations that you can reach out to and get involved because they're just so willing to do that. And again, I'll just leave you with, diversity is not a one-man show. It really requires partnership. It requires planning. It requires a certain level of knowledge of the demographics that you're dealing with and having a bit of cultural awareness. It's a lot of different things, but I think if you can, start with one, you can start with one demographic, or if you can start with a few and start to affect some changes in those areas, I think you will become a lot more confident about what can happen and what is possible and, ultimately craft something that works across the board.